Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel, and a merry continuing 12 days of Christmas to all of you. I'm going to continue my series, which I began last time, on Luke's central section, which is a notoriously difficult section to explain. And I'm calling this series Harmonization in Action because part of the point of my doing this is to show that harmonization does not cease to be relevant as a historical tool when something is difficult. Some harmonizations are so obvious that they almost don't deserve to be called harmonizations. And in those cases, they just sort of present themselves to you as the obvious theory unless you have been really confused by literary criticism of the New Testament or of some given set of documents, and you're looking to make things in conflict. But sometimes things are more difficult and it's messy. And when that happens, it does not mean that automatically we should go with some non-harmonization theory, not even a good faith error. And I would say in the Gospels, never should we be going with the idea that the author deliberately changed the facts, because I don't think there's ever a good argument here in the Gospels for that. Some people do deliberately change facts when they tell things, but I don't think that theory is ever happens to be justified as we're looking at the Gospels. But even a theory of error doesn't automatically become the best theory just because something is difficult or messy. Sometimes when the evidence is difficult or messy like that, that's exactly when harmonization is most needed. And I want to illustrate that by talking about Luke's central section. And I'm going to resist the temptation to summarize at too much length what I said last time. This concerns the section beginning at about Luke 9:51 and going through about Luke 18:30. It's a lot of chapters of material. And in Luke 9:51, it says that Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem because the time was coming that he was to be received up or taken up. I suggested last time that this refers to his leaving Galilee and his Galilean ministry being ended and going south to Jerusalem, but that then there were about 6 months when we can tell from John he was traveling back and forth to a couple of different feasts before he actually died at the time of the Passover of the following year. And that's actually a very fruitful theory. There was even an undesigned coincidence I was able to bring up, so go back and watch that previous video. But that's or listen to the previous audio. But that's the context of this next presentation that I'm making here today. This presentation is about the wealth of sayings material in these chapters. There's a whole bunch of material here that concerns sayings of Jesus, which are not they're not put into any context. And that's going to be the point of what I'm going to say today. That is important because if you try to make a saying be in a context when the author's not putting it into a context, you can think that there is a contradiction, you can think that there's something wrong, and even go so far as to say that the author deliberately changed the facts when that's not justified at all because there's not a context there to begin with. Now, to explain this, I want to access something that familiar listeners, viewers, readers will already know, and that's the distinction that I've made between achronological and dyschronological narration. And those are my terms that I've coined for concepts that are not entirely new, but I have really pushed for using these concepts more consistently and more explicitly so that we know what we're talking about and we can ask people to satisfy the burden of proof that they have if they're really saying that an author narrated dyschronologically, which is to say deliberately changed the time when something happened. A quick review on that. Dyschronological narration occurs when an author deliberately makes something happen at a time or take a period of time that he knows is not literally accurate. Or a speaker could do this. And I don't think the authors of the Gospels ever do that. A chronological narration occurs when you're just not saying when something happened, the order in which something happened. And we still do that today, even when we're being completely honest. You might be telling a story about someone you knew, and you might just say, he said this, or he used to say that, or one day he said this other thing. And you're not putting it in any particular context. You're not putting it in any particular order with something else that you might tell about that he said. And not only in sayings, you might say, I did this and I did that and I did that, and you're not trying to put them in any particular order. That's a chronological narration. And the gospel authors do this. Now, I'm not saying that they never imply an order. And I don't want to be misunderstood here as saying that any time a chronology is implicit, it is not just absolutely explicit, that means it's a chronological narration. The judgment can be difficult about whether an author intends to imply an order or not. In Luke's central section, and with regard to some of the incidents and many of the sayings, I think the evidence is extremely strong that Luke is often narrating achronologically here. And I'm just going to give you a few examples. Just open up from about the end of chapter 10 in Luke, because you could still order the events chronologically after 951 and through the return of the 70 that Jesus sends out. But from about 1025 onward through toward about, as I said, 1830, and just look at all of the vague statements about when something happened. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up, tempting him. So this is the introduction in 1025 to the parable with the Good Samaritan. 1038, now as they were traveling along, he entered a certain village. We'll be talking about that more next time. But when, as they were traveling along. 11:1, and it came to pass that while he was praying in a certain place. What place? When was he praying? 11:5, and he said to them, so even though he's still talking about prayer, does this even occur at the same time as the sayings begun in 11:1? Not clear. 11:14, and he was casting out a demon. 11:29, and as the crowds were increasing. When were the crowds increasing? So he said these things as the crowds were increasing, but when is that? 17:1, and he said to his disciples. There's a lot more. That's just a sample. And I think it's just full of these indefinite statements. Why is this useful to us in understanding this central section of Luke? Well, first of all, it's useful to prevent us from getting impatient, because 951 says he set his face to go to Jerusalem because the time was coming for him to be received up. And then there are all these chapters of material where it's not indicated when this is happening. And if we're trying to fit all of that into his last 6 months, we might be saying, well, when is this going to end? Or how does this stuff all fit in here? Now, some of it probably was said during his last 6 months. In fact, I have a discussion in an earlier video of he's traveling and the Pharisees come to him and say, get away from here, for Herod will kill you. And that actually fits really well into the Perean ministry. You can go back and watch that video. But in some cases, Luke is just what I call chunking in. He's got this sayings material or these incidents that he knows happened, and he has them from his sources, very plausibly sources that are independent of at least our Greek Matthew, the Greek Matthew that we have. And he doesn't have a context for them, I would say, plausibly. And so he's just putting them in here. So it can prevent us from getting impatient. Second, it can prevent us from trying to locate something geographically when we don't have evidence that Luke is trying to locate it geographically. So there's a place in chapter 14 where it says he has a meal at the home of a Pharisee, but it doesn't say where. It also doesn't say when. And this leads into a section where Jesus is just really telling off the Pharisees. So was this possibly in Jerusalem? Could this even have been during Holy Week? Or was this somewhere in Perea? More likely, I would say, to have been in Jerusalem on one of his visits to Jerusalem in this last 6 months, but Luke just doesn't say, and so we shouldn't be insisting on locating that geographically when Luke doesn't do so. And then the third reason, as I mentioned already, is to prevent us from attributing a context to Luke when Luke is not giving a chronological context. So he's in some cases giving neither a geographical nor a chronological context. This could mean that even some of these sayings were spoken in the Galilean ministry, because they're so contextless that it looks like Luke had the knowledge that Jesus said these things, but maybe he didn't even have a time when he said them, so that they could be coming all the way from prior to the time indicated by 951. And so these are just kind of being dropped down in between the statements that he was journeying to Jerusalem. Now, as I've mentioned, his journeying to Jerusalem can fit in those last 6 months because, according to John, he went back and forth for different feasts. But then in between them, it's all this other material. I want to apply this to a particular case where another scholar has attempted to attribute dyschronological narration to Luke, and I think that's wrong. This concerns chapter 17, and I'm just going to read verses 1 and 2. And he said to his disciples, "It is inevitable that stumbling blocks should come, but woe to him through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea than that he should cause one of these little ones to stumble." Okay, Luke 17, 1 and 2. And then it goes on and just has sayings in verses 3 and 4 about forgiveness. In verses 5 and 6, the apostles say to Jesus, "Increase our faith." And it's just like random. And the apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." So he says something about faith. And in verses 7 and following, he's talking about what it means to be a good servant of God and whether we should be proud of our service. So it's not even particularly topical, but it also doesn't give any temporal ordering. It's just kind of dropped, he said this and they asked this and he said this. There's a concept that is used by a scholar named Mark Goodacre, and it's the concept of editorial fatigue. I think it's important to realize that when Goodacre and others use the concept of editorial fatigue, this is a concept of factual change. I think Goodacre is fairly clear about that. Dr. Michael Licona also likes to use it, and not always completely explicit that he's talking about a theory of factual change. In a different context, Goodacre has suggested that Luke essentially tried to make up an extra parable by changing a parable in Matthew about the 10 talents, and that Luke just wasn't as good a storyteller as Jesus, so when Luke was trying to make up an extra parable, putting it in Jesus' mouth, it has these literary failings, and those are evidences of editorial fatigue, and that's how we can tell that Luke was changing the facts from Matthew. And I think that's a very poor theory, but that's just an example of how this is factual change. Now, for chapter 17, 1 and 2, the idea is that Luke is moving this saying, and this would be dyschronological moving, to a different context from the context given in Matthew and Mark, and that he accidentally leaves the reference to one of these little ones there, even though there, quote unquote, are no little ones in the context in Luke. In Matthew and Mark, there is a very explicit reference to a child, and Mark pretty explicitly places this saying or a saying very much like it in Capernaum, which is up in Galilee. Matthew and Mark agree very closely and are clearly talking about the same incident. The disciples have been arguing about who will be the greatest. They come into a house, possibly even Peter's house, Jesus places a child in the midst of them, and he tells them they need to become as little children to enter the kingdom of God. And then he goes into this thing about how it would be better for someone to have a millstone around his neck than to cause one of these little ones to stumble, and it fits especially well because there's actually a child right there. So the editorial fatigue theory is that Luke is trying to put this saying about the millstone into a completely different context and just forgot to erase the reference to one of these little ones. Maybe if he was moving it deliberately, Jesus should have said, "A little one who believes on me," or something like that, instead of one of these little ones, because there, quote unquote, are no little ones in the context. But I would challenge you to open up chapter 16 and 17. Chapter 16 is the end of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus, the rich man, and Lazarus, the beggar. And chapter 17 just begins, and he said to his disciples, as I pointed out, very indefinite, and then just kind of jumps around from one topic to another. And the apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith," and so forth. And the point I would make is that there literally is no context here. And I would defend that, and I think you can tell that if you read these chapters with an open mind, and especially that move from the end of 16 to the beginning of 17. It's very abrupt, and very abrupt jumps to different sayings and so forth. Are there children present in the context? We don't know. There's certainly not some context where children are not present. When does this take place? We don't know. Where does Jesus say this about the millstone? Unclear, unstated. Okay, so it's confusing, it's wrong, it's incorrect, inaccurate to say this is a context that Luke is putting this in chronologically later than Matthew and Mark, and where there are no children. And then he just forgot to erase the children. And wow, isn't this wonderful? We can see how Luke is using Matthew and Mark, or I think Goodacre would have said Matthew specifically. And that shows us what they're doing, and that gets us away from this idea that they're never changing the facts. They're always just engaging in, or attempting at least to engage in, accurate literal historical reportage, because there you go. Luke's moving this to a context with no children, but oopsie, he forgot to remove the children. That's a really strong overreading of what we actually find. And I think that's really important. The concept of achronological narration and the concept of Luke just sort of chunking in sayings and even some incidents like the visit to the Pharisee's house into his central section can help to guard us against that kind of overreading, and can help us to not just accept something that we're told. This also emphasizes the importance of actually opening your Bible and reading what somebody wrote, instead of just letting someone else describe it to you and go, "Oh, well, I guess so. I guess he must be right." Go and look for yourself. Now, what I've said thus far still doesn't explain everything in Luke's central section. There's more to say. As I say, it's a difficult section. Next time, I'm going to be talking about a geographical puzzle that bothered me for quite some time, relating the healing of the 10 lepers later in chapter 17 to the story of Mary and Martha back in Luke 10. And how do these relate geographically and chronologically? How can the concept of achronological narration help us there as well? So I hope you'll come back next time, and I hope you'll like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, and I also hope that you'll let people know about the audio content on the Lydia McGrew podcast, at Anchor FM, and these other audio outlets. And thanks again to Eric Manning for doing that for me, because some people really prefer to listen to the content in audio. So please be sure to come back next time to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.